So first off, a couple business things. You had your thesis assignment due today. If you haven't done it yet, get it to me ASAP, just on the Blackboard or email. Should be pretty straightforward. Nothing too complicated. It's just like 6 sentences long. You've got your outline assignment due next Monday. Class time, again, shouldn't be too complicated. We'll be talking about what I'm looking for in class today. If you have not yet, you are going to be getting feedback on the thesis assignment tomorrow morning once I finish doing all the grading on them. Should be by around noon or so. But it's just going to be basically pass, fail, and you're going to have worked pretty hard to fail. And then I will be adding in additional comments if there's anything that really stands out. But it should be pretty straightforward. The other thing I want to say is that expect some emails from me over the next few days. I waited until the last week so I wouldn't bother you guys too much. But expect some emails about teacher evaluations. Basically, it's your chance to grade me. If you think I sucked, you can say I sucked. If you thought I was good, you can say I was good. If there was anything in particular you think I could improve upon for future semesters, please let me know. I really appreciate it. It's really, really helpful for me. It's really helpful for the department. So if you can do those things, I very much would appreciate it. I will send out the email with the link. It takes about 10 minutes to do. That's that. All right. Any questions thus far at this point? Anything? Are we good to go on to the next bit? All right. No questions. Then basically, I'm going to pick up today's class from what the additional video was that I posted last week. So that additional video was on the first part of writing papers. I am now going to talk about the second part of writing papers. And basically you can follow along with this even if you didn't have a chance to watch that first video yet. It's about 25 minutes, a half hour, so it's not too long. It's up on the YouTube. If you have any questions about it, feel free to reach out. That was basically just a general, why do you write papers? What's the point? Actually taking the time to answer those questions because not many people do answer them. So today's going to be really the practical thing. You've now got a thesis in front of you. How do you turn that thesis into a paper? So first off, what did we say, or what did I say in the last thing? What is a thesis? What is the thesis of a paper?
Like what you're arguing for?
Yeah, it's the core idea. It's
Big ass fucking showroom in that.
So it's basically the thing that all the other sentences in the paper are going to be working towards. It's the thing that at the end of the paper, everything else is designed to get across. So for instance, if you are discussing what's better, cats or dogs, then the sentence, cats are better than dogs or dogs are better than cats, that's the thesis. So for the assignment this week, I wanted you to tell me what the 6 theses were for the 3 paper prompts that I gave you. So each paper prompt had 2 sides you could argue for. Just to run through it, I'm not going to be writing it down, and I'm just going to briefly say it, and then you'll get more in-depth feedback on your individual answers when I type it out tomorrow. But the basic idea was for the first one, the 2 theses would be basically, in this paper, I will argue that you should shoot your friend. In this paper, I will argue that you should not shoot your friend. Those would be the 2 possible theses. And the second one, first thesis would be something like, in this paper, I will argue the Krogan are morally reprehensible and should be judged. And the second one would be, in this paper, I will argue that the differences in Krogan society means that we cannot judge the Krogan. Then the third one would just be, in this paper, I will argue that so-and-so should be allowed to start their website. In this paper, I will argue that so-and-so should not be allowed to start their website. So all that sound along those lines. You, of course, are going to have slightly different wordings, but that's the general gist. That's all a thesis is, that one sentence of this is what this paper will argue. We good so far?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Awesome. All right, so now what I want to do, and we're probably not going to end up taking the whole class, we're just going to talk about 2 main things. And these are going to be, what do you do now? Once you've decided on your, well, let's talk about what the steps are. The first steps, you've now read over all the prompts and you've thought about what all the possible theses are. Step one is now simply going to be pick the prompt you want. So you just really go through the 3 prompts and see which is the one you want to write a paper on. And this is entirely a matter of personal choice. It is things like what you think will be easiest and what you think will be most interesting. Michael.
Yeah, quick question. I was just wondering what it says on the pick the prompt you want, like on the left side, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, the red, this I'm going to write up in black and maybe it'll be visible. Steps in writing process. So you can basically think of what you're doing at this point is coming up with the order, the steps you will take to churn out a nice paper, and then also what will the structure of that paper ultimately look like. So these kind of go back and forth where you go through this and then the coming up with an outline, this will more or less be the answer to one of the steps down here, but it says steps in the writing process. Step 1, pick the prompt you want. And this is a personal thing. If you find free speech the most boring thing in the world, don't write on prompt 3. If you think shooting your best friend is a horrible thought you never want to think about, don't write about prompt 1. If you just have always thought aliens were cool, write about prompt 2. Totally up to you. I think they're all about equally difficult, and I think it's totally a matter of personal preference. Then, once you pick the prompt, decide on thesis. And this is basically, you've now seen what the possible theses are by doing the thesis assignment. Now you just decide which of those is the one that you find most interesting. So which of the papers are, or which of the theses is the most interesting to you? You just read them and think, which one do I like better? All right, does this make sense to everyone? Thus far, this should be pretty straightforward. It's just you've read the prompts, you decide what you want to write on. And I know this isn't the most interesting stuff, but I think it is helpful. And now we can talk about the next thing. The next thing you want to do is start deciding how, I'm going to put up 3. Out, or I guess brainstorming. So basically, if we think back to our complex arguments unit from earlier in the semester, what we did was we talked about the way in which a single conclusion can be supported by multiple arguments or multiple different reasons combined together to support a main thesis. So in this case, what you want to do is think what the various reasons you might give to support your thesis. So if we were coming up with an answer to the, say we were arguing the thesis, New York City is best city in US. For this to be your thesis, you are then going to have to support it in the rest of the paper. You're going to come up with reasons to prove that this is true. And remember, the overall goal of a paper for this class is not just to say why you think it's true, but to give reasons that would convince someone else that you are right. So in the brainstorming phase, what you're doing is thinking of possible reasons to support your thesis. So what, if this was our thesis, are some possible reasons we could come up with?
The best pizza.
Best pizza. What else we got?
Broadway shows.
Shows and culture. What else we got?
Transportation in the U.S.
Best public transit. So yeah, basically what you're doing in this stage is just coming up with reasons that you'd be able to support this claim. And what you can think of each of these reasons doing is each of these reasons will correspond to a paragraph in the overall structure of the paper. And what you basically want to do is, if your thesis is the main thing you're arguing for, you're going to want to pick reasons that are not just reasons you think, but which you think would form a paragraph that you could then use to convince somebody else that this is one reason that New York is the best. So what you're going to want to do in this sort of situation is just lay out and brainstorm in your head, write it down, just various different reasons that you think matter. So if you're going to argue that so-and-so Carl shouldn't be allowed to start his website, when you're brainstorming, you're going to come up with the various sorts of reasons that he shouldn't be allowed to do it. Things like, starting violence, or things like it's racist. And what you're going to want to do is think about what reasons would actually convince somebody else that this is a good conclusion to draw. And this is really the next step. Does this make sense to everyone? We good on this front?
Yep.
Okay. So, and the key to a good reason is not just what you think, but again, it's about thinking what you would have to say to convince somebody else that what you're saying is correct. So it's thinking about what somebody else would think about what you are thinking. Again, more complicated than it seems. All right, so once you've started brainstorming the reasons, think about the ones that you need. Now, in a paper like this, you don't need to cover every single reason in favor of something. In fact, it's better in a paper like this to just talk about a few really core ideas and go into depth on them. So next week, I'll talk a little bit more about what that going into depth looks like. But you just basically want to focus on, generally, you don't want to go above 3 reasons to support your claim. And so you wouldn't want to discuss every single reason that that this species is bad. You just want to focus on a few of them for prompt 2. For the first one, you don't have to say every single reason the right thing to do is shoot your friend. Instead, you're just going to want to focus on a couple. And once you've brainstormed, got them down, the next thing that is helpful to do is outline. So what do I mean by outline? Well, there are a few different ways of doing this. It really comes down to what works best for you. But generally what I find helpful is to make basically a bullet point list in which, or even better, like headings and subheadings. And what I basically do is design an outline where each point on the outline corresponds to one paragraph of a paper. And the goal here is to basically it's basically designing the skeleton of what your paper will ultimately be like. And you think, what sorts of paragraphs do I need? What order will they go in? And that's basically what the outlining process will involve. So what should that look like? What does a good outline for a paper in an intro philosophy class look like? Well, let's start with, well, first off, how many paragraphs, this is going to be like a general question. How many paragraphs should be in a paper, and how long should each paragraph be? Give you a clue, it's a trick question.
4 to 5 sentences, I guess.
So the trick question is, how many paragraphs should there be? However many you need. And how many sentences should be in a paragraph? However many you need. And this is one of the things that is tough about paper writing, is that there's never one single clear answer. Remind yourself what the goal of a paragraph is. The point of a paragraph, the reason we indent, is to add structure to our papers. And the goal is for each paragraph to make it easier for the reader to recognize what the thought is that you're looking to convey in this paragraph. So if in your paragraph about why New York is the best city in the world, you have you want to talk about food and you want to talk about Broadway show and cultures. Those are 2 different ideas. So because they're different ideas, they should be their own paragraphs. Now, how long that paragraph should be? Well, it depends on what you're doing. If you just want to focus on pizza and the importance of pizza and how good New York City pizza is, well, then it's going to be a shorter paragraph than if you want to talk about every type of food imaginable. If you want to talk about a few different types of food, have one paragraph on pizza, another on varieties of cuisines of different ethnicities, one on something else. That if you want to cover all those different areas, then maybe divide this one paragraph into several paragraphs. A paragraph can be as short as a single sentence. A paragraph can be as long as an entire page and a half, 2 pages. What you need to ask yourself is, what is the overall goal that I'm trying to accomplish right here? And how many sentences do I need to accomplish that goal? And again, how many paragraphs do I need? Well, it's going to come down to how many different reasons I want to discuss. And however many reasons there are is going to determine the number of paragraphs. And while the overall number of paragraphs is kind of up in the air, there are generally a few different paragraphs that you're always going to want to include. And generally, these are the paragraphs that come at the start of a paper. So generally speaking, there's a formula you can follow for a first paragraph. It doesn't have to follow this exactly, but it's generally speaking going to be helpful if you stick to this overall formula. And again, put your own spin on it, but generally here's what you're going to want to do. So first off, I gave you all a bunch of imaginary stories. You are now presenting your views on this story to a reader who, to make sure that you're clear that your argument is super clear, you have to assume your reader doesn't necessarily know the situation. Pretend you're not writing to me, but you're writing to somebody who's less familiar with it, so that you're able to show me that you understand every detail of the prompt well enough to demonstrate a mastery of the material. So given this goal, what's the first thing you're going to want to do to give this paper? What is the first few sentences? What are you going to want them to discuss?
Your thesis.
So the thesis is going to be in this first paragraph, but before you could even give the thesis, there's something else that has to go here. The thesis is actually going to be B. What is A going to be? So if I'm asking, if your thesis is, I believe that the Krogan should be judged as a species, what is somebody who's not familiar with the prompt going to ask?
So you're going to have to introduce the topic and tell them, what you're going to be discussing within your body paragraph.
Exactly. The first thing you want to do is describe the case a little bit. So what that means is basically what I'm asking you to do is paraphrase my prompt in your own words in enough detail that captures the key points without just repeating everything I say. Think of it this way. If you were trying to explain to someone why New York City was the best city in the world, you'd have to explain some general facts about why this is coming up, who you're having this argument with. So in this case, it would be something like, one day I'm walking down the street, then the devil pops up, he says, just something to set up the background. Now, once you've done that, the thesis can come in. And this is, once you've explained to your reader what's at issue, then you can explain what is the core thing I'm arguing for. This will make sense once you've described the background. And then C, optional, I'm putting this as optional, but it can be very helpful, especially in a first paper. And this is what I call the game plan. What is a game plan? In a sport or in anything, what does the game plan do?
So it sets up what you're going to be doing throughout the whole game. It
Exactly.
gives, idea of like the positions and what you're going to be doing.
Exactly. It's basically a short, simple description of what is going to come next. So in a sport, it's a thing where it's like, this player will do this from this position. In a paper like this, remember, your overall goal is to prove to someone what your thesis is. So in this case, the game plan is literally you telling the reader exactly what you plan on doing. Or another way of putting this is what your reasons are and what the order is in which you will be describing them. So if we had our New York City prompt and we were going to discuss New York City food, New York City culture, and New York City transportation, what will our game plan look like? Well, the first sentence would be something like, in this paper, I will argue that New York City is the best city in the United States. That would be your thesis. Once that's done, your game plan would simply be, I will do this by first arguing that New York City has the best food. Then I will argue that New York City has more culture than any other city in the United States. Finally, I will explain why the New York City public transportation system is the best and the benefit this gives to the city. That is what I mean by a game plan. And the point of the game plan is just to help the reader know what's coming next. And it has a secondary benefit of when you're writing the paper, oftentimes you'll write a little bit, then you'll stand up, walk away, then come back. And if you're anything like me, you might not remember exactly what you were talking about the moment you walked away. So if you have a game plan there in front of you, you can look back at your game plan and remind yourself, what is it I'm supposed to be doing here? Oh yes, I'm supposed to be talking about food. So if you then start talking about, pet law about New York City, then you know you've gone off course. Does that make sense to everyone about what this idea of a game plan is? You doing okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And again, I'm sorry this is not the most interesting way of doing it. I'm yet to find any way of making talking about writing papers exciting. It's just, I'd much rather they seem boring than seem terrifying. So that's the goal, is to make it boring enough that we're not terrified about the writing process. So this is, generally speaking, in an argumentative paper, what you want the first paragraph to do. You set up what's being argued about, you say what your thesis is, and then you say how you're going to be arguing for that thesis. Because remember, the goal is to provide a reasoned defense of the thesis, which means coming up with a collection of reasons that work together to prove why your thesis is correct and why anybody else should accept that thesis. Any questions at this point at all? It can be about any of the things I've said, any general questions about theses or roadmaps, or game plans or case description, anything.
Yeah, Professor, I had a question. So for
Yeah.
example, one of them was, for thesis, because I wasn't sure if I did it correctly. Let's say, for example, the one with the different planet, I wrote, that those species, because they're so far away, and it doesn't affect our planet, then that's the reason why we shouldn't, in a sense, judge what they're doing. So would that be the correct thesis in that sense?
So what I would say is, in that sort of thing, the thesis would simply be, we shouldn't judge them. And then you could say they're so far away, it would be better to treat that as one of the reasons in support of the thesis. So with the thesis, you want it to be the straight up general statement of what, and then you can think of the reasons as because. Now on this thesis assignment, part of the reason I did it is so that we can all talk about and learn what you're looking for. With a thesis though, generally speaking, you want it to be as broad, just a broad answer to the question. And then everything else here, the reasons are the because. So in that case, that would it would be a fine thesis in the paper. But in terms of structurally thinking, think of it more as that is a combination of a thesis and a reason, is what I'd say there. But you're definitely you are on the right track. And if you included that in that paper, it'd be totally fine. If we're talking super clear cut. Any other questions at this point? All right, something I want to talk about briefly before moving on to what the next few paragraphs should look like is this word. And I just want to say this because I think it is a useful thing to say. And I want to talk about what I am looking for in this paper generally to try to lower the anxiety levels. There are many people out there who care about spelling. There are many people out there who care about grammar. There are many people out there who care about punctuation. I am not one of them. For this paper, I'm really focused on, can you practice argument structure? Eventually, once you've gotten this stuff down and you're in other situations, yes, spelling matters. People will judge you because people are snobby about spelling. If you don't use a comma correctly, there's going to be some pedantic person who's going to judge you for it. However, none of that stuff matters if the underlying ability to form structures and arguments isn't there. And I would much rather for this paper, you put your brain power into practicing the arguing side of things and don't worry about the spelling. So in this paper, if you don't know how to spell something, I don't care. If you don't know how to, what the correct word is and use a slightly different one, as long as I'm able to figure out what you're talking about, I don't care. Do not stress about those things. Worry about the content of your arguments. I will never take off points for spelling, grammar, messiness. I only care if it gets in the way of my understanding what you're talking about. As long as I know what you're talking about, I don't care. Along the same lines, in a paper like this, small words are your friends. Do not feel the necessity to use a long, fancy word to seem like it's extra fancy. Short words are better. They're more to the point. They illustrate the point better. When you're trying to argue something to someone, if they can't understand exactly what you mean, then you're not going to be successfully able to persuade them. So don't be afraid to say things like, in this paper, I will argue that, or by this I mean, or in the next section, I will argue blah, blah, blah. Don't worry about this. I know that in other classes, this sort of thing matters, but for this class where the main thing I want to practice is writing argumentative papers, do not stress about grammar, spelling, care about structure and making sure I could understand what you mean. Does this make sense? So when you hear me using I will as like in the examples, I literally mean you're allowed to say in this paper, I will yada, yada, yada. That makes sense? Because these ideas are hard enough. You don't need to use complex language to make it messier. All right. So this is what paragraph 1 should look like, generally speaking. You can change around the order if you want to give your game plan before the thesis, that's fine. But generally speaking, that's the way to think about paragraph 1. Now, paragraph 2. This is one which is very good to include, and a lot of people fail to remember to include this one. This is what I generally call the need before you can begin. Actually, I'll put definitions you need before you can begin. So what do I mean by this? Well, in a paper prompt about a philosophical topic, it will very often tie in with a key philosophical notion, or even in something like a paper about a new type of technology, it's usually going to be involving something that is complicated and the average person might not understand. So for instance, imagine that you were trying to argue with your grandmother about why she should invest all of her money in Bitcoins. If you're going to successfully convince your grandmother to invest in cryptocurrency, what are you going to have to do before she's able to understand your argument? If you're going to successfully persuade her, what will you need to do first?
It's explain what cryptocurrency is.
Exactly. The idea is that many times you are going to be discussing something that the other person might not necessarily understand. So before you can even convince them why you're correct, you might need to explain what it is that you are interested in or what it is that you're talking about. So if you were discussing cryptocurrencies, you'd have to say what cryptocurrency is. Now for these paper prompts, so for the first one, the should you shoot your friend, one of the things you might want to bring up is if your thesis is going to be something like, I will argue that you should shoot your friend and your reasons have to do with one of the theories we talked about, something like utilitarianism, then in the definitions, you're going to have to describe what utilitarianism is. In the second thesis, the one about the Krogan and their views across the world, what's something you might have to mention in order for your argument to work? Explain it to a reader.
Cultural relativism?
Exactly, Cameron. Cultural relativism. You can't say, I'm going to argue you shouldn't judge them because of cultural relativism, and then not explain what cultural relativism is. Finally, the third prompt, the one about Carl K. Carlson and his website. What are some things you're going to have to say in this, or what are some terms you're going to want to define for this one?
What is white supremacy?
White supremacy is a good one you might want to describe. What are some other ones? What is it called when you say very mean things to someone using language?
Hate speech.
Hate speech, yes, you're probably going to want to define that one. Another one, if you're going to be arguing that even though he uses hate speech, he should still be allowed to start the website. What thing that exists in the United States are you probably going to want to talk about?
Freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech, exactly. So these are the things you're going to want to bring up. So in this paragraph, what you're going to want to do is start off with a sentence like, but before we can understand my reasoning, we need to define a few key terms. And I literally mean, make that, what I just said, the first sentence of the paragraph. And this is going to be a good opportunity for me to step over here. And has everyone marked down the first 4 steps? The pick the prompt you want, decide on theses, brainstorm, outline, because I'm going to use this board space. All right. So if nobody has any objections, I'm erasing it. So this right here, that first sentence, is what I call a signpost. I need new markers, but I don't want to buy them because then they'll dry out over the summer. So I'm going to make it through the final couple classes with these terrible markers. All right, signpost. So the signpost is a type of sentence that is very common to argumentative writing. It is basically a special type of transition sentence. So basically, what does a transition sentence do? What is it to transition? Well, you start with one thing, then you move to another one. So what a transition sentence does is it is the sentence that gets you from the end of one paragraph to the start of the next one. As you change ideas, you don't just want to shift. You instead want to lead the reader through from one to the next. And what the signpost basically serves as is you can think of each paper as made up of paragraphs, and each paragraph almost as its own mini paper. Each paragraph has its own thesis or introduction or main topic. And what the signpost is the sentence that really serves as the mini thesis or the paragraph-sized core concept. So a signpost is going to be a sentence that occurs at the beginning of a paragraph that says what is going to happen in that paragraph and how it fits in with your overall argument. So going back to our New York City example, in your example about, or if your reason that New York City is the best is that it's got the best food, or to use Nicole's actual example, it has the best pizza. When you're thinking about the next paragraph, what you're going to want to do is have a sentence that says something like, to begin, I will discuss blah, 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 because this will and there are a few different ways this could go. So it would be something like, this will put us in a position to see. So the idea with these signpost sentences is they are there to help your reader understand how all the different parts of the paper work together or fit together to prove the thesis. So it'll be something like, the signpost for this definitions paragraph would be something but to begin, I will define the terms free speech and hate speech, because without these definitions, one cannot properly understand why Carl can start his website, or just something like this, or However, to begin, I will first discuss what the city of New York is for anyone who's not heard of it. That's what I mean by a signpost. It's just the first sentence of a paragraph, which really provides the core idea of what the rest of the paragraph is going to do. And whenever you're doing your outline, it is useful to write out what the signpost will be. So on the signpost, or on the outline assignment, one of the things to do is to write out a signpost that would be useful in that point. So for your first one, it would be like, however, before we begin, we need to yada yada. Or the first thing to consider is some key terms, because this will allow us to do so-and-so. Does this make sense to people? It can feel a little unnatural to include such substantive transitions, but it's a really useful way of making sure that you are speaking so clearly. The way I like to talk about it is when you're writing an argumentative paper, the goal is not simply to give someone true statements. The goal is to give an argument that is so obviously true or so clear that even the dumbest, laziest, meanest person will understand, like, all right, this person has a point. The goal of being persuasive in an argumentative paper is to force someone to accept your conclusion. Does this make sense? Of this way in which you use these sentences at the start to structure a whole paragraph. So you would begin with this sentence, and then you would go through and include these definitions, and these will just help it flow much, much, much more clearly. Any questions at this point about signposts or about paragraph 1 and 2?
I have a question. Under signpost, I can't really read after the first underline. It says because this will
put us in a position to see blah, blah, blah. It's just basically the way to think of these. I might have to get new markers sooner than I'd like. The basic idea is that in the signpost, what you'd be doing is just both saying what you're doing at this point in the paper and why you're doing it. So it's usually of the structure. At this point, I will blah, 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 because yada, yada. So in this case, it says, it would be something like, because this will put us in a position to see so-and-so, or because then we can consider yada, yada, or anything along those lines. Any questions at this point? Other than, why do my markers suck so much? Which I don't know, because they were supposed to be new. At least the black one was. All right, now, so this is paragraph 1 and 2. We've got describe the case, and then we've got your definitions. And now is where the reasons come in. And the way you can think about paragraph, let me try black. No, that is dead as hell. Paragraph 3. All the way down to paragraph last second to last. Sorry about the squeaks. I'm trying to make it legible. So basically, once you've got your definitions paragraphs, you now get into the real core of the paper. And the real core of the paper is going to be providing the reasons that are meant to support the thesis. So these are what you can think of as the premises in your argument. This is your conclusion. This is necessary background information. And then the paragraph 3 to the second to last paragraph are going to be paragraphs in which you lay out your reasons and explain why those reasons show that your thesis is correct. So in our New York City example, you would have one paragraph discussing why it's the case that New York has the best pizza, explain why that's true, and then also explain why the fact that that's true shows that New York is the best city. In your paragraph about Broadway, you talk about why Broadway, the fact that New York has Broadway, what that gives to New York that other cities lack, and why that proves your thesis. So to go with our example from the actual prompts, the first one, if you're going to argue, you're going to shoot your friend. You might say something like, the first reason I should shoot my friend is because he told me to. Then in that whole paragraph, so that would be your signpost, like this. Like paragraph 2, you're going to start with a signpost. But instead of it mentioning definitions, it would be something like, I will now explain the first reason why you should shoot so-and-so. Or simply, the first reason that you should shoot so-and-so is yada yada. Or something like, now that we've understood the definitions, I will begin to explain why you should shoot your best friend. All of those would be signposts to start off a body paragraph. Any questions? So the idea with the body paragraph is each paragraph corresponds to one of your reasons. And each reason will be one of the things you use to support your thesis. It could be any number of things, but think about it in the outline. What you're going to want to do is write out what each paragraph will do, and then say what your signpost for it would be. So let me just pull up the assignment sheet just so I make sure that I'm giving it to you in the correct order. Signpost assignment. So I give you a nice little outline here of what exactly I'm looking for in the assignment. But basically, what I'm going to be looking for in the outline assignment is that the first thing you do is you write out something like paragraph 3, and then you just give a little summary of what you're going to do. So it would be, in this paragraph, I explain that New York has best food. And then the second thing for that paragraph is you just write signpost. And then you write out what your signpost for that paragraph will be. I will not be grading this very strictly. Again, like this one, it's pass fail. And basically, if you gave it a valiant effort, even if it's off, this is just to get you to practice writing the paper. This is the logistics of how you would do it. And for each body paragraph, you're going to want something like this: the topic of what you'll be discussing in that paragraph and what the signpost would be that you would use to begin to talk about that topic. And that this is where there's no right answer to how many paragraphs. How many paragraphs go here depends on how many reasons you want to address. That's why I say the second to last. And then the last paragraph is just a conclusion. And a conclusion is literally you just restate your thesis and what you've done. It's almost you just give the game plan again. And this is just a signal to the reader that you've finished and you're done with the paper. Does this make sense? I want to make sure I'm being as clear as possible. Again, I'm sorry it's boring, but I want to go with clarity over interesting.
Makes sense.
Okay. Any questions, worries at this point? This is basically how I think you should, generally speaking, approach paper writing for this class and also for any sort of argumentative paper. Now, what I want to do briefly here at the end is just talk about what reasons can look like in your paper and just give like an outline of what the different sorts of things you could bring up are. But before I move on, I just want to make sure there are no questions at this point.
Yeah, can you just go over what the conclusion is gonna entail?
Okay. So what you mean? What the paragraph itself would actually look like, Andrew?
Yeah, what's gonna entail?
It would literally go something like this. If I were to speak it out loud, because my markers are dead and I'm running out of space, I'm just going to speak it. It would be something like, at this point, given the reasons I've discussed, it should be clear that New York is the best city in the world. This is because New York City has the best food, the best culture, and the best transportation system. That could be a conclusion. As simple as that. Just remind the reader of what's in it. You could add on another sentence at the end, which would be something like, well, there are those who might disagree. These reasons show that those people are wrong, or something along those lines. It's really straightforward. The only way you can really mess up a conclusion is by forgetting to include it. Other than that, you're basically in the clear. Just literally, it's just basically a repeat of the thesis and the game plan again, just to remind the reader. It's almost like I just gave you a bunch of reasons. Now let me put a little summary on the end. It's like a book.
I was just about to say, so it's basically a summary of everything that you
Exactly.
wrote throughout the essay.
Yep, it's basically to remind the reader, because remember what I was saying about trying to convince someone of your thesis. It's literally trying to pound them over the head with the right answer. So or what you think the right answer is. You give them your thesis, you explain what you're gonna do, then you're gonna do it, and then at the end, you get to the end and say, this is what I just did, and here's why I'm right. It's literally the best arguers are the people who leave their person they're arguing with no choice but to admit defeat. No gaps, no anything. You just force feed that person what you want them to believe. Any other questions on this stuff here? And then I'm just going to briefly discuss what good reasons can look like, because there's a lot of different answers, and this is where the real devil's in the details. And I also want to talk about what we're going to discuss next class. All right. So when you're writing a paper like this, the ultimate goal is to prove your thesis, and there are many different ways you can do that. So a reason can be something as general as just like in our example of this thesis of New York City, it's just a very general statement, like one of the things that's good about New York. However, other things you can do rather than those general reasons is you can compare. So sometimes, and these theses are like this, there's two sides to it. It's not just like a general thing like, is New York the best city? It's rather a specific one like, should I or should I not shoot my best friend? You have two main options. So a reason does not necessarily have to be, let me argue for my reason. Another thing you can do is explain why the other person or the other side is wrong. So it's like in a case in which you were arguing with someone, what's better, New York or Boston? One way you could argue for New York being better is to explain why New York is great. What's the other way you could explain that New York is better than Boston? You don't have to say New York is great. What else could you do?
Why Boston is worse than New York?
Exactly. You can just say why Boston sucks. If you go spend a whole time talking about why Boston sucks, that will also show that New York is better. So in this sort of paper, another option you have for a reason, you don't necessarily have to say, this is a good reason for me. You could also say, this is a bad reason, this other side is bad for this reason. So different types of reasons are possible. The ultimate goal is to convince a reader that your thesis is true. So whatever you need to do to prove that that's the case. Another thing you can do, which is kind of related to that one, is to give a counter response that person might give, and then shut down their response. So an example of this would be, imagine we're doing our New York City one, and you say New York City has better food, and then have somebody come along. And so imagine we start with New York City has better food, and you spend a paragraph explaining why New York City pizza is the best. Now, a reason could be something like, now someone from Boston might say that pizza is not the most important food and shouldn't be factored in when considering the quality of New York. However, the fact of the matter is that New York City's betterness in food goes far beyond its pizza. In fact, and then you could talk about how New York City has way more restaurants and way more variety than Boston. So this would be here's something someone might say in response to me, and here's why that response is no good. So different ways you can give a reason or an argument for your thesis. So another thing you could do in this would be someone like, if we talk about the Carl K. Carlson case, if Carl says, what you might do is say, now someone might say that Carl should be allowed to start his website because of the importance of free speech. They might say X, Y, Z. However, that argument is no good. Let me explain, blah, 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 blah. That would be another way you could do a reason. So either say outright why the other side is bad, say why your side is good, or say an argument the other side might try to give and why that argument is bad. All of these are ways of arguing for your thesis. So when I'm asking you, give your reasons in this outline, any of those sorts of reasons are allowed. Whatever you think will make for an interesting paper, a paper that you want to some degree, write, that is a thesis about one of these prompts. Are there any questions at this point about anything? I have said everything I want to say today about paper writing. I'm going to just briefly describe what I'm going to talk about next class. And, but if nobody has any questions, I'll do that. But if anyone has any questions, ask them now. Yeah.
I had a question. So basically for the summary, you want us to do something like a bullet point, like of reasons and stuff like that?
Basically, I use bullet points personally. If you're someone who'd rather write it out in paragraph form and just say like, first I'll do this, then I'll do that. My signpost for this part would be yada yada. That's totally fine. I just personally, the way my mind works, I like bullet points. The structure of it really doesn't matter that much, just so long as you, by the end, I should know how you think your paper is going to go well enough that I in the margins can write. I think this might be a useful thing to bring up. Focus on this.
Okay,
Any
got
other
it.
questions at this point?
Thank you.
Are we good? All right. In that case, what I'm going to talk about next week is just how do you turn an outline into a fully fledged paper. And the way I think about this is basically think of the thesis as your brain. Think of the outline as the skeleton. And then the rest of the paper is putting the meat onto the bones. And so what I'm going to talk about next time is how do you add meat to the skeleton of your paper? And you can't have a good paper. Like think of it like an organism. If you had no bones, you'd just be a puddle on the ground. But if you had no meat, the bones couldn't move. So you need them both. And what we're going to talk about next time is really in depth. How do you go from outline to full paper? So that's what we'll do next time. If you have any questions on the outline assignment, feel free to reach out. I will be sending back the theses assignments tomorrow morning. If you have any questions about anything, feel free to reach out and expect some emails from me about how to grade me because it would be helpful. Plus, if you want to say I was crappy, this is your chance to do so. All right. Any other questions, comments, concerns, feelings? Otherwise, have a great evening, and I will see you all on Monday for our last class.
Thank you, Professor.